Good evening, everyone. I'm Erik Dalhuijsen, and among other things, I used to be a petroleum engineer. In fact, I met Ian Phillips first in 2012 when I was involved with the CCS project, which incidentally is also what got me into climate action, and which indirectly caused the founding of Aberdeen Climate Action. I changed my title to something less interesting, but it'll cover the same. I'm going to cover a number of subjects which I think are important to understand the big picture of CCS and what we're talking about here. And to open up, just a quick question that I've found in discussion, people aren't really aware of. What drives the oil and gas industry's interest in offshore wind? I'll just quickly run through because it's important for the CCS story. Basically, all companies in the UK have a requirement to reduce their CO2 emissions. They have to, or they're not allowed to operate. And so also with the platforms in the North Sea. The problem with the platforms is they produce quite a lot of emissions. About 4% of all the emissions of the UK are in the offshore sector. And the switch, what you normally do, you just buy green electricity and then you're out of trouble. Nobody wants to sell you green electricity in the middle of the North Sea. So you make your own. And that's how the oil industry gets involved. So you build a wind farm, and then the wind farm pays for the cable ashore, and you take some power off of it for your platforms. That's the core driver. And of course, the main point is that you need 24 hours. So you basically use the same cable to provide the platforms with power when the wind isn't blowing in your wind farm. So that's the core of it. The idea is the wind farms pay for the cable so that the oil industry doesn't have to do. And of course, the oil industry is familiar with these kind of big, complex projects and are perfectly capable of purchasing the knowledge that they need to build them. The other thing they get with this is a seat at the transition table. And what that entails, that's really quite important. Now, first of all, of course, oil companies are suddenly into renewables development, so they have a say in renewables rollout. Now, that's important for their own needs, for getting their own renewables, wind farms going. But we've seen historically, specifically in offshore Germany, where oil companies undercut actual wind generation companies in the bids for the sectors, and then subsequently do not build the wind farms for a range of reasons. And there's a Shell project on the north coast of Germany, which has been not a project for several years already. And I heard this from a Danish company, which is very familiar with building wind farms, but was outcompeted by their unrealistic price. So, okay, there's subterfuge in all industries. But the other thing that you get at this table is you get to offer transition expertise. And one of the things that has happened, transition used to be the transition away from oil, away from hydrocarbons, that we saw in Ian's talk as well. And in Scotland, this transition, and in the UK actually, is now about the transition of the oil industry. Yeah, so the oil industry gets to park a whole bunch of other things in this conversation because now they are the future energy providers and they are transition experts. So they turn CCS into a transition industry, as we saw from Ian's talk, and I would fully support. It isn't. It's something that you can use, but the transition is no fossil fuels. Okay, and then the next step is, of course, let's build some new fossil fuel infrastructure, and then we have CCS. We can do it away, and that's happening in Peterhead at the moment, and I'll touch on that later. And it's one of the things that Friends of the Earth is also involved with. We have let's grow blue hydrogen, and it's another thing. Once you're around the table, you're talking about transition, you have the CCS, but you don't actually have enough CO2, and I'll show you that in a minute. So you need to find a way to produce CO2. Hydrogen is great because you can sell more gas if you produce hydrogen, and with CCS, you can pretend that everything's cool. Okay, so that little bit on wind. We'll come to the rest later. I'm going to do very short on climate change. Climate change is about greenhouse gas emissions, tipping points, and is very urgent. There's other crises and all linked and involved, and you can solve them all at the same time, but that's not happening. This is the line we saw. This is emissions, not energy use. Now, in 1987, when the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel for Climate Change, was formed, and we were completely aware that climate change was a problem. We looked at our budget. We had to reduce our emissions gradually until about 2100, 2150. So there was plenty of time to do that. Very slow changes would have done it, a reduction of 1 to 2% of emissions per year. However, Paris Agreement 2014, 2015, all we done was increase our emissions. And that meant that our carbon budget is massively reduced from well into the future to 2050. That's where this 2050 point comes from. And as you can see, it's not a straight line to 2050. It's all the easy stuff first. Now we're in 2024. We didn't change anything. So just by burning that extra bit of oil and by not reducing it, we've committed to that, is it pink, purple thing on the top of the right, and it's reduced our budget even further. So politically, we're still talking about 2050, but we don't have a budget to last to 2050. In fact, we're lucky if we make it to 2040. Depends on how you calculate it. So if the CO2 concentration in the atmosphere is high, more tipping points in the climate system are tripped, and at some point you have bigger risk of runaway climate change. The thing is, if you look at this plot, things need to change profoundly and for the long term, and that's really important. This is not business as usual. Big things have to change. The trick is you can change them in a way that is actually beneficial for people, or you cannot change them in a way which is not. And just an additional point, this is a plot from the IPCC, the latest report, AR6. After you reach net zero, you need to go to negative emissions because you still need to bring the CO2 content of the atmosphere down. And that is a separate section. What we're going to talk about is CO2. Just a quick reminder, where are the greenhouse gas emissions from? I put a red bar and a yellow bar around the collection. The top two, CO2 from energy and methane from energy, that's more than 3/4 of all the emissions, is from the production of energy from fossil fuels. Okay, how would you reduce emissions? Reduce the demand or change the supply to fossil fuels. And this is, of course, what we need to do. And yeah, there are people who say, oh, but we can't go back to the dark ages, we can't go back. This is from the IPCC report. We don't need as much energy as we think we do for good living standards. And that is very clear. And that is actually a change from the previous report already. So the amount of energy we need for good living standards is going down, as in we realize that we don't need that much. Okay, now there are a few other things that you need, that you can do to reduce these emissions. You can separate convenience from needs. Yeah, what is essential from what is trivial? Do you need to own a car, or do you just need transport? If you can do that better, there you go. Do you have to fly, or do you just need a decent travel time and this is something else you can do? There are quick interim solutions which sound like helpful action. That's also really good. Yeah, turn down the thermostat. That makes a difference, right? Or capture some flue gases while we build these renewables. Yeah. The important bit here is you can do it. It's an interim solution, but you need to do the big stuff, which is to change your system. And then the third point is negative emissions in the future. Now, that is related to direct air capture and various other things, which are an extrapolation of what Ian was talking about. The problem with that is often that when you set up and you say, well, we're just going to extract this stuff from the atmosphere for the next 50 or 100 years, then what you're doing is you're designing a machine now, which other people will need to pay for and run continuously for no benefit for them. Basically, just because you are not prepared to reduce your emissions, they need to spend generations doing that. So basically, how I translate it is the young and the unborn are cursed to slavery by you, by not reducing your emissions. Anyway, back to the IPCC on a happy note. They also have their views on what you need to do. This little plot, which is actually a picture from the World Resources Institute, and I have to say they brought this out the day after the IPCC report came out or something like that, so they must have had a better insight. I haven't been able to find these 10 points in the IPCC report, but admittedly, it's a 2,000-page report. So anyway, good. They start with a good point: retire the coal plants, invest in clean energy, retrofit, decarbonize buildings, decarbonize cement, the hard-to-abate sector. All really important stuff. There's two things missing, which I noticed. One of them is, you say retire coal plants. What about retire oil and gas plants? The interesting thing is that the IPCC is very explicit about that in the report. but the World Resources Institute obviously didn't think it was important enough. And you'll also notice that CCS is not in the top 10. And if you look at the news in the UK, you'd say that CCS is really the thing we need to do, right? Whereas this is where all the money goes. It's not in the top 10 because it shouldn't be in the top 10. Okay, first, what about retiring old oil and gas infrastructure? I say it's in English because I actually had the IPCC quotes, and they use about 10 times as many words to say the same. We need decommissioning and underuse of existing fossil fuel installations, or we'll knacker the climate. It's explicitly in the IPCC report. We need to cancel new installations, which are planned already, or we'll knacker the climate. New fossil fuel infrastructure in the current NDC commitments up to 2030 will already knacker the climate. So what we think we're going to build is already going to force us to exceed our budget. And existing infrastructure at capacity already exceeds the 1.5 degree pathway. So everything we use now will knacker the climate already. Yeah. So when anything involves building new fossil fuel infrastructure, you understand that the IPCC has very clear views on that. So what's the problem? Why don't we just retire oil and gas infrastructure? The thing is, unburnable fossil fuels and stranded infrastructure are worth between $1 and $4 trillion for the 2 degree scenario. Yeah, and far more for the 1.5 degree scenario. And you're fighting against an industry which is about to lose between $1 and $4 trillion, and they're going to fight back. If CCS works, then fossil fuels will be used longer, increasing the climate risk. Again, this is straight from the IPCC report. And the high CCS option, which is producing more first using CCS to bring it down, is worse than we think for the climate. Okay, so just quickly on the IPCC, what are they? They compare scenarios. In this case, these are the mitigation scenarios. And they looked at over 1,200 scenarios, which are linked scenarios of what do we do with the climate simulations, which is what do the temperatures evolve to. They have different areas of focus. It doesn't really matter. The main point is the bottom phrase, the mitigation pathways are not intended to be comprehensive. They are just some academic teams' ideas of what you could do to arrive at a certain temperature range. So the solutions that are modeled here are not the only ones. Okay, so what is CCS? Ian explained it much more elegantly than I did. I will. You extract CO2 from the air or flue gases, you store it somewhere, and you hope it stays there pretty much forever. 10,000 years is typically enough, but that's for an engineer forever. The problem is there's lots of technical uncertainty, high cost. There's lots of risks sloped onto an uncertain future. And an important point is the future might not be able to continue these schemes. Yeah, if the climate is knackered, they'll be busy staying alive and killing each other for living space. Yeah, which does sound kind of funny when you write it down, but it's actually how it's going to be. Okay, so what is CCS for? The Global CCS Institute, where you get all the CCS information from, is a lobby group, by the way. They say CCS great, tackles industrial emissions, you prevent CO2 emissions from the use of fossil fuels, and you can tackle the hard to abate sectors, that's cement and steel and ocean transport, things like that. Looking at the UK, where are the UK greenhouse gas emissions from? If you look at the right, top right, that's industrial processes, right? That's 2% of total UK emissions. That is the hard to abate sector and industrial emissions together, 2% of the total UK emissions. That's not going to make a big difference for the UK emissions, right? Now, you see that yellow triangle at the bottom right? That is Drax. Drax on its own is the biggest CO2 emitter in Europe, single point emitter. Drax on its own at the time when I put this together 2 years ago was doing about 5% of the UK total emissions, but it's not reported. So it's not in this disk because we pretend that Drax is clean and doesn't emit anything. But it is. And I came across recently that it's between 3 and 4%. It's a lot. Now, the other sector that's of interest here is this blue section. That's the energy supply. So that's basically gas-fired power station and what is necessary to get the gas in there. And you see the little green sector, that is the UK North Sea emissions. That's 4% of the total, but that is taken on in there. So if we use CCS for what it's designed for, the industrial processes, then in the UK, you can't get very far. So the industry is going to look at using it for this other sector, for the temporary sector, for the fossil fuels we need to not produce at all. Okay, so why? The core of CCS is to burn fossil fuels for longer. That's the essence. And according to the IPCC, again, and this is the biggest compilation of peer-reviewed climate data that is available, that increases climate risk and it increases total global societal cost. That is a really important thing to take into account. So society will be worse off if we burn fossil fuels longer, because a lot of these changes that we need to do are actually better for society. Now, another point to remember is merely the promise of CCS, because yes, there are working installations, but they don't work up to the spec that you need to counter climate change. So they're not working in the context that we need. We have cars, but we don't have the Formula One car yet. We have a car that you can do 15 miles an hour with, but that's not where we get how we get them. So the point is CCS is really interesting for the fossil fuel industry, and therefore it's also for the government because they're very close. But to sound acceptable, it must do something for the climate at some point in the future, maybe. So the 3 points to look at. One of them is solving the hard-to-abate sector, long-haul transport, shipping, steel, cement. And of course, the miracle CCS solution is blue hydrogen. Suddenly, because we can use CCS, we can use hydrogen, we can sell gas. This is fiesta for the oil industry. And then the other point is CDR, which is carbon dioxide removal. That is to find a way to get CO2 out of the atmosphere. And I split them in two. One of them is negative emissions from burning biomass. PECCS. You'll hear more about that. It's a really important role. It's probably the main role for CCS to play. And the other one is direct air capture. That's what Ian showed us. Is not this. I call it techno-salvation at the future's expense. Now on CDR, we have, I'll come to this later. Right. I need to, okay, CCS saves the hard-to-abate sector, not according to ARENA, the International Renewable Energy Agency. They say the effective emission reduction pathways, that is how quickly we get down, and therefore the quicker we get down, the less CDR we need. They are run by renewable energy and energy efficiencies. Carbon Tracker, big organization, financial organization, analyzes the financial impacts of carbon emissions and the uncertainties in the future. They say very clearly, don't do CCS on the iron and steel sector, as the CCS organization advises, because there are better alternatives, which are actually literally better, but also more stable for the future and climate compatible. So they say the only thing you can use it for now is cement. So focus on that until better options come up. And just for your information, I know someone who's working in these, there are better options coming up. So CCS in 15 years is not going to be valuable for cement because we'll have other solutions for it. I'm done with it. 3 minutes over. Okay. Well, one of the problems with carbon dioxide removal, and I'm just going to stick to this slide, is the moment the IPCC says carbon dioxide removal is going to be important, then this is the outcome. McKinsey comes up, says, as if it's suddenly a surprise. Finally, the IPCC has recognized that the carbon removal is critical. So it's time to act. And what they mean is the report that comes out a few I think just 2 or 3 months later, carbon removal is how to scale a new gigaton industry. And what they mean is a new kind of $1 industry. So they basically want to find a way to extract as much cash as possible out of the fact that suddenly you need carbon removals. And how do you maximize this? Same for the other ones. Even though the IPCC explicitly states here, explicitly in their report, that CCS applied to fossil fuel CO2 does not count as a renewable technology, that gets forgotten in the translation. But it's these commercial drivers which really, which really spoil the game. I'll skip that. Yeah, just a little bit about the politics. Keir Starmer allocated 22 billion for CCS. Yeah. And this is a summary of a lot of woolly words that he uses. And I have to say that this was mostly woolly words too. He was trying to find out what he was actually expecting to happen. And he says, providing jobs and value creation. That's as far as I got. So we're going to get jobs and value creation, whatever that means. In Scotland, that's for 22 billion pounds, right? In Scotland, the First Minister, John Swinney, was a little bit more gentle and a little bit less generous. So he offered 2 million for investigation of the pipeline for CCS. And he listened to the propaganda because he said the fair and just transition of the oil and gas sector was what he was delivering. And of course, there is absolutely no requirement or desire even for the fair transition of the oil and gas sector. There's a requirement for the fair and just transition of the people who work in the oil and gas sector. But the industry, when the industry makes something that is no longer required, then the industry goes down. That's it. That's how industry works. Yeah, this is a little bit about how that works. You saw, because one of the problems is that the government is so, basically their advisors, and they've actually been taken to task by The Guardian and by Carbon Tracker, that on their whole CCS strategy, they only listen to fossil fuel people doing this. And they haven't listened to any of the other areas of expertise that are not paid by the fossil fuel industry. And the fossil fuel industry is really explicit. This is, again, this is 2 years old. Equinor very clearly stated they don't want to be a renewable company, right? They want to be the world's most carbon efficient oil and gas company. Shell is looking for expansion. BP is looking for expansion. BP is looking for expansion, but at the same time, BP is now the official decarbonization advisor of Aberdeen Council. Yeah, because the path to net zero is part of BP's new strategy, but of course, their expectation is that they will increase their gas turnover. Yeah, the regulator is same side. Where am I? Yeah, I just want to touch on one thing, which is the health benefits. And this is, again, straight from the IPCC report. They state, and this is with very high certainty, yeah, which is unusual for the IPCC. The health benefits alone are the same or higher than the cost of climate mitigation. Basically, if we do everything to get these emissions down, then the health benefits on their own will deliver more benefits than the cost of this whole exercise. And they also make very clear that GDP doesn't tell this story. And GDP doesn't tell a relevant story either for people or for the climate. So what do we need to do? We need to reduce demand, and we need to grow renewables and storage. And we need to invest in the important solutions. I do think we should spare a few million, but no more, for CCS. But CCS needs to be pursued as the niche it is. Yeah, it's not going to solve all the problems. It is for the oil industry, but for the world, it isn't. And don't count on CCS. It might not work as we hope. So far, everything progressively is becoming more and more difficult. Every time, the better you investigate, the more difficult it becomes. And for the locals, don't count on CCS jobs. They're advertised a lot. It's the transition industry. Oh, this is going to solve everything. CCS doesn't actually require that many workers to either build, to design or to operate. It just involves a workforce to construct the machines and the plants. But there's also a very big requirement for constructing active transport infrastructure, extend the electrified rail network, doing retrofit in 22 million homes at least. There's a massive construction that is required that gives permanent climate compatible jobs, and it's a completely different scale, but you won't read that in the I'm going to leave it at that. I've spent my time too much. Thank you. Sorry.